When you hear the words Panama Canal, you probably picture a ditch, a long trench cut straight through the land, connecting the Atlantic Ocean on one side to the Pacific Ocean on the other. Water on both ends at the same level, just like any other canal. Ships sailing in one side and out the other in a straight line. That's what most people think it is. That's what the word canal usually means. A waterway dug through land to connect two bodies of water. But that's not what the Panama Canal is at all. If you could see a cross-section of how a ship actually crosses Panama, you'd see something completely different. The ship doesn't sail straight through at sea level. It sails up, lifted by enormous chambers filling with water, rising 26 meters into the air. Then it crosses an artificial lake sitting in the mountains. Then it gets lowered back down 26 meters on the other side. You don't cross Panama by going through it. You cross it by going over it. And understanding why that difference exists, why they couldn't just dig a ditch like everyone assumed, reveals one of the most dramatic engineering failures and successes in human history. For centuries, Panama was exactly what it looked like on a map. A thin strip of land blocking a shortcut between two oceans. Ships traveling from the Atlantic to the Pacific had two choices, and both were terrible. Option 1 was to sail all the way around the southern tip of South America, through the violent waters around Cape Horn, where storms could shred a ship to pieces. The journey took weeks or months, depending on the weather and how lucky you were. Option 2 was to unload all your cargo on the Atlantic side of Panama, haul everything across land through jungle and swamp, then reload it onto different ships on the Pacific side. Slow, expensive, and brutal. Everyone knew there had to be a better way. The idea was obvious. Just dig a canal straight through, connect the two oceans with a channel, and let ships sail right across. It sounded simple. And when the French decided to do it in the 1880s, they had every reason to believe it would work. They had just finished the Suez Canal in Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. That project had been a massive success, a triumph of engineering. Why wouldn't Panama work the same way? So they arrived with the same plan. Dig down to sea level on both sides, remove everything in between, and let the water flow through. A sea level canal, just like Suez. But Panama was not Suez. Suez had been built through flat desert, dry sand and rock, predictable terrain. You could see what you were digging through, plan the work, and execute it in a relatively controlled environment. Panama was the opposite of that in every possible way. There was no flat ground. There was jungle so dense you couldn't see 10 meters ahead. There were rivers that looked calm one day and became raging torrents the next when rain hit the mountains upstream. There were hills and ridges of volcanic rock that had to be cut through, and the rock was harder than anything the French equipment was designed to handle. And there was rain, constant heavy tropical downpours that turned the excavation sites into seas of mud and triggered landslides that could bury an entire day's work in minutes. Workers would blast through rock, clear the debris, and start digging. Then the rain would come, the slopes would turn to liquid, and tons of mud would slide back down into the trench they'd just cleared, sometimes burying equipment and workers along with it. It was like trying to dig a hole in wet sand on a beach. The walls kept collapsing inward no matter how much material they removed. But the real killer wasn't the terrain. It was disease. Yellow fever and malaria spread through the workers at a rate that's hard to comprehend today. Thousands of people died, not from cave-ins or explosions, but from mosquitoes. At the time, nobody understood how these diseases actually spread. Medical science hadn't yet connected mosquitoes to the infections. Workers lived in camps surrounded by standing water in barrels, ditches, and puddles, which created perfect breeding grounds for the insects that were killing them. The more replacement workers arrived, the faster the diseases spread through the camps. The French kept digging anyway. They poured money and men into the project, convinced they could push through if they just tried harder. But the ground wouldn't cooperate, and the death toll kept climbing. After years of this, after spending hundreds of millions of francs, after losing an estimated 22,000 lives to disease and accidents, the French project collapsed. The excavation stopped. The company went bankrupt in a scandal that shook France and ruined thousands of investors. The dream of a sea-level canal through Panama died with it. The idea seemed impossible. The land had won. And then the Americans showed up with a completely different idea. When the United States took over the project in the early 1900s, they had one major advantage. They could see exactly where the French had failed, and they understood something crucial that changed everything. You cannot dig a sea-level canal through Panama. The terrain won't allow it. The rain won't allow it. The mountains and rivers and unstable ground make it physically impossible to maintain a stable trench at sea level across that landscape. The French had proven that, with years of failure and thousands of bodies. So the Americans stopped trying to fight the terrain and decided to use it instead. The solution was a canal with locks, a system of giant water elevators that would lift ships up and over the obstacle, then lower them back down on the other side. A ship enters from the ocean at sea level and sails into a massive concrete chamber called a lock. These chambers are enormous, over 300 meters long and 33 meters wide, with walls rising 24 meters above the water. Gates close behind the ship, sealing it inside. Then water flows into the chamber through enormous culverts built into the floor and walls, rushing in by gravity alone. The ship begins to rise, floating upward as the water level increases. The vessel doesn't move under its own power. It just rides the rising water like an elevator made of liquid. In about 10 minutes, the ship has climbed over 8 meters without using any fuel. The front gates open, and the ship sails forward into the next chamber where the process repeats. After passing through 3 locks on the Atlantic side, the ship has climbed 26 meters above sea level and enters Lake Gatún, the artificial reservoir sitting in what used to be mountain valleys. The ship sails across this lake for hours, crossing the continental divide. Ocean-going vessels, some as long as 3 football fields, navigate through what looks like a mountain lake in the jungle. Then, on the other side, the process reverses. The ship enters locks that drain water out instead of filling it in, lowering the vessel back down to sea level on the Pacific side. This was the idea that saved the project, but it created a new problem that the Americans had to solve before any of it could work. Where do you get the water? Locks consume enormous amounts of water. Every time a ship passes through, the chambers fill and drain, and that water doesn't cycle back. It flows out into the ocean, and it's gone forever. To operate the canal, you need a constant, massive supply of fresh water. The Americans solved this with one of the boldest pieces of the entire project. They built a dam across the Chagres River, one of the most unpredictable and flood-prone rivers in the region, and created Lake Gatún. At the time it was built, Lake Gatún was the largest man-made lake in the world, and it served 2 purposes at once. First, it acted as a reservoir, storing the rainwater that fell across the entire region and feeding it into the lock system as needed. Second, it became a navigable section of the canal itself. Ships didn't just get lifted over Panama, they sailed across a lake that hadn't existed a few years earlier. This turned the problem into a solution. The rain that had destroyed the French excavation now powered the entire system. The river that had caused devastating floods was tamed into a controlled reservoir. The landscape that had been an impossible obstacle became part of the machine. But building all of this required solving the other problem that had killed the French: the diseases. The Americans launched a massive public health campaign unlike anything that had been attempted before. They drained swamps, cleared standing water, installed screens on windows, and fumigated buildings. They didn't fully understand germ theory yet, but they had figured out that mosquitoes were spreading the infections. So they declared war on mosquitoes and attacked the problem systematically. It worked. Yellow fever cases dropped dramatically. Malaria infections fell to manageable levels. Workers stopped dying at the catastrophic rates the French had experienced. And with a healthier workforce, construction could actually proceed at the pace needed to finish the project. But even with disease under control and the lock system designed, there was still one massive physical obstacle sitting directly in the path of the canal: a ridge of hills and solid rock that had to be removed. The Culebra Cut, also called the Gaillard Cut, is a massive trench carved through the continental divide. It's the section of the canal where the ground is solid volcanic rock and steep, unstable hills, and every bit of it had to be blasted away and hauled out. For years, explosives tore the rock apart in controlled detonations. Steam shovels dug into the rubble. Trains hauled away the debris, carrying millions of cubic meters of earth and stone away from the site, day after day, without stopping. At the peak of construction, the rail system moving material away from the cut was one of the most complex logistical operations on the planet, with trains arriving and departing every few minutes around the clock. But the ground fought back. The slopes were dangerously unstable. Every time they blasted and dug, the walls would shift and collapse, sliding back into the trench they'd just cleared. It was the same problem the French had faced, just on a smaller and more manageable scale. Workers would excavate for weeks, and a single landslide would bury everything overnight. This went on for years. Dig, clear, collapse, repeat. It was exhausting, dangerous, and seemed endless. But unlike the French, the Americans had the resources, the organizational structure, and the determination to keep going. They kept digging until the cut was finished, no matter how many times the slopes came down. By the time the Panama Canal opened to traffic in 1914, the project had taken 10 years of American construction following the French failure. It had cost hundreds of millions of dollars and reshaped an entire region. Thousands more workers had died during the American phase, though far fewer than under the French. But it worked. Ships could now cross between the Atlantic and Pacific in hours instead of weeks. Trade routes that had been impossibly long became practical overnight. Naval fleets could move between oceans without sailing around South America. The canal didn't just shorten distances, it changed the entire global map of commerce and military power. But there was a catch built into the design, and it's still affecting how ships are built today. Because the canal uses locks instead of being a sea-level channel, there's a maximum size for any ship that can pass through. The chambers are only so wide, only so long. If your ship is bigger than the lock, it doesn't fit. For decades, this created a global ship design standard called Panamax. Shipbuilders around the world designed vessels specifically to squeeze through the Panama Canal locks, with length, width, and height, all calculated to fit, with just feet of clearance on each side. This worked until global trade outgrew it. Container ships got bigger, tankers increased in size. The original canal became a bottleneck. So in 2016, a new set of locks opened alongside the original ones. Bigger chambers for larger ships called Neo-Panamax vessels. But even with the expansion, the canal still has limits. And the biggest one isn't the size of the locks, it's water. Every ship that crosses the Panama Canal consumes about 52 million gallons of fresh water. That water flows into the locks, drains out into the ocean, and never comes back. Where does that water come from? Lake Gatún. And where does the lake get its water? Rain. If rainfall drops, the lake level falls. When that happens, the Canal Authority has to limit the number of ships that cross each day, or reduce the maximum depth allowed for vessels, forcing them to carry less cargo. This has already happened. In recent years, droughts have forced the canal to reduce traffic. Ships have waited days or weeks for their turn. Some have been turned away entirely and forced around South America, adding weeks to their journey. What looks like a permanent feat of engineering is completely dependent on weather patterns nobody can control. The rain has to fall. The lake has to fill. If it doesn't, global shipping slows down. So when you picture the Panama Canal now, forget the image of a ditch cut straight through from ocean to ocean. What actually exists there is a system of massive concrete chambers that lift ships 26 meters using nothing but water and gravity. An artificial lake created by damming a river, serving as both reservoir and shipping lane. A trench blasted through volcanic rock that took years to dig. And a complete dependency on rainfall that makes the entire operation vulnerable to dry seasons. The French tried to build a sea-level canal and failed catastrophically. 22,000 people died, and the company went bankrupt. The Americans succeeded by giving up on that idea entirely and building something else. Not a traditional canal, a water elevator system that lifts ships over the obstacle instead of cutting through it. And that elevator has been lifting ships over Panama for more than a century, as long as it keeps raining.